Welcome, everyone. My name is Annie. I'm a librarian at Kent County Public Library. I'm very pleased to welcome you this evening to Reconsidering the Roles of Women on the Chesapeake. This is part of our 2020 One Maryland, One Book programming. You may know Maryland Humanities is the sponsor of One Maryland, One Book, which is a statewide community reading program where we get as many people as possible reading the same book. This year, it was The Island of Sea Women by Lisa C. And then we gather people together to discuss the book, or as in this evening, themes that are related to the book. This year, One Maryland, One Book also received support from the Institute of Museum and Library Services and from the Maryland State Library. If you've attended One Maryland, One Book programs in the past, you know that Maryland Humanities relies on input from participants to help shape the program's future. At the end of the program, I will be providing a link to a brief survey. You will also receive a follow-up email with that link. If you can take a couple of minutes to complete that, it would be much appreciated by us and by Maryland Humanities. So with those housekeeping notes out of the way, I want to welcome Jennifer Dolde to our virtual room this evening. She is an Associate Curator of Collections at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum in St. Michael's. She is also an author and has spent over 2 decades as a museum consultant working with small cultural institutions throughout Delmarva. This evening, she is bringing her expertise around women on the Chesapeake. For those of you who have had the opportunity to read The Island of Sea Women, you'll know that it is about a matrifocal society of women from Korea who dive for food. And we are taking that piece of the book and we are looking at it through the lens of our local community. I'm going to turn the evening over to Jennifer, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Annie. And can you give me a thumbs up that my screen is visible?
It looks wonderful, yes.
Wonderful, great. I'm working with 3 screens and 2 computers here, so technology at work. I'm so pleased to be here to talk about our work at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, uncovering the roles of women. And I want to start by saying that I read this book as well, Island of Sea Women, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's clear that as a work of historical fiction, Island of Sea Women is the result of extensive research on this female-centered economy of divers. It's a unique culture that has drawn attention, like so many cultures, just as it is disappearing. So Sea had the luxury, the writer's freedom to compile and imagine some of the details that really made the story come alive. But historians, like myself, rarely have this kind of rich detail. Museums are arbiters between academics and the general public, and we're challenged to create a complete and concise narrative that captures visitors' attentions visually, as well as through writing, and it's usually, as I said, has to be pretty concise. So while mainstream textbooks and histories fall 20 years behind academic scholarship, matter of fact, women's history didn't even really enter school textbooks until the 1990s, museums actually have a real opportunity to translate the latest research and to collaborate with our communities for interpretation. To that end, the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum is actually launching a formal process toward diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, but we've long worked to incorporate all these histories of women and other underrepresented groups as part of a narrative whole. So it's an exciting and challenging time for us. We know the stories are there. Often we have to work harder to uncover them, and as a result, there's a need to shed specific light on what's been missing in order to be inclusive. Museums are uniquely able to interpret that history. Dynamically, we have material culture, we have objects of use, tools, artifacts, documents, artwork, audio, and graphs. And photographs is what we'll be focusing on this evening. We have a rich collection at the Maritime Museum of over 50,000 images. We have photographs as art, such as the work of photographers like Robert de Gast, Aubrey Bodine, and Constance Stuart Larrabee. We have journalistic and documentary photographs. And then we also have casual snapshots, family photographs collected by ordinary people who captured daily life and work life without intending to. So we also then have to ask ourselves what wasn't photographed. And what we know is that women were present, even if they are not recognized. So I always like to start with my personal connection. Finding hidden histories with an emphasis on story has long been my personal interest. This is Addie Vickers, my great-grandmother, born in 1856, the daughter and the granddaughter of ship carpenters in Church Creek down in Dorchester County. So it's no surprise that 24 years old, she married William Brannock, a sailor 10 years older than her, in the presence of another captain, James Fuchs. A similar schooner called Richard Linthicum. Growing up, the very floorboards in my classroom, in my bedroom, I should say, had evidence of being eaten by ship's worms. And I wanted to know more about these people and not just their names. They had 3 daughters. And then my grandfather was born in 1895. And by that time, his father was frequently out to sea. And this may explain the stories about my grandfather's wild behavior. Or any when I did hear something. According to those who knew her, grandmother Addie and her daughters were prim and proper and strict. They dressed for dinner daily. On Sundays, all the shades were drawn and they sat in their white gloves and no one was allowed to do anything. No work, no play. Addie called her husband Mr. Brannock, which might perhaps explain why so much time stayed. In 1900, Reese discovered a Baltimore Sun article reported he came home and was called home because one of the family's hogs had gotten so large that it was terrorizing the family, and she called him home to take care of it. When he butchered it, it was reportedly 732 pounds and 7 feet in circumference. More seriously, on more than one occasion, Captain Brannock and his ship were threatened, and once he was driven miles out to sea during a storm off of Cape Hatteras and believed lost. And to me, it makes me wonder if this wasn't why she needed to have rules. She had feelings of insecurity after years of raising these children and managing a household on her own while he was gone. In 1907, Captain Brannock was called home once again because his wife was in a coma. But then he was the one who died of pneumonia. She was widowed. She was 53 years old. My grandfather was just 13, and she lived another 40 years on her own. So here's just a glimpse of the story of a ship captain's wife. It's taken me 30 years to piece together that family lore through newspaper articles and family legends, just to understand a little bit about what her life was like. It makes me wonder and ask myself how I would have responded to that kind of life. And so that's why when we collect images and objects at the museum, we try to get as much information of provenance as possible. It gives us insight into the stories about the people behind the objects and adds dimension to our interpretation in order to represent the whole narrative. So when we survey our collections at the Maritime Museum, what kind of photos do we find? We find photos from the trained eye with professional composition, which are ideal for exhibition, but with some notable exhibitions, those tend for dramatic, oystering against a winter sky, action shots of hauling in a net full of fish. But what about the ordinary experiences? And sometimes we do uncover the ordinary or the universal. Here we have a young girl holding a dip net in search of crabs as a neighbor boy rows her on Mill Creek near Annapolis. This is a photograph by Robert de Gast, born in the Netherlands, immigrated to the United States, and worked as a photojournalist based out of Annapolis. For magazines such as Chesapeake Skipper, the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, as well as books about the Bay. So we all know that if you've grown up in this area, that dipping for crabs, exploring marsh edges and river shorelines is just part of growing up. It's a rite of passage for anyone growing up along the Bay. And de Gast captured this by simply being a patient observer. He didn't pose his subjects, and that's evident in this image. He captured a single moment in time that with one single shot tells us a story. And then we have more casual photographs. This is a family photograph belonging to Richard Judd Henderson. He was born in Baltimore and moved to Gibson Island. He was a skilled sailor who wrote the book Chesapeake Sails, A History of Yachting on the Bay. And this photo was taken on the Miles River in 1908. It's identified as Mary Donald Tillman with her friend Graham Johnson and other friends, called Miles River Belles. Graham Johnson, as it happens, along with his brother Lowndes, was a yacht designer on the Miles River and involved with building and racing those vessels. So this could have been a yacht club excursion, but clearly a casual shot. But the woman is working the lines. She's clearly having a good time. She's certainly appears to be from a more privileged class, as Miles River Belles would indicate. And here we have a couple photographs from Charles Nieblock. He was also a commercial photographer from Baltimore, known primarily for his photographs of coal schooners, and they were used in books by Robert Burgess, including Burgess's book, Chesapeake Circle. Burgess was a well-known curator and writer in the last part of the 20th century. So here we have two images, one of this entirely chaotic scene of a family, I guess, about to go out boating. I believe this was Nieblock's family. So you contrast the chaos and fun of the scene on the left. I mean, how in the world are they going to fit all those people in two boats in their dresses? With the very elegant and relaxing image on the right of the woman aboard a schooner about to take an excursion. So, you know, we can suppose what the stories are here, but it also gives us some insight into the evolution of women's clothing, beginning with bathing dresses and bloomer style bathing suits. These women are dressed for boating, but can you imagine wearing something like this on a boat? Now, if we look further, we see the changes in this image by Constance Stuart Larrabee, woman at a fuel dock on the Chester River, made in the 1950s. Clearly a kind of a glamorous shot, but once again, this woman seems self-sufficient as she's looking toward the fuel dock during a boat outing and documenting her journey, perhaps. This is probably a marina on the Sassafras River that Larrabee knew well. Constance Stuart Larrabee, for those of you who aren't familiar with her work, had documented indigenous people and tribes in the poor white communities in South Africa, and then went on to be a World War II photographer. She moved and turned her eye to the Eastern Shore in the 1950s after she married and moved here. So her subjects were very different on the shore, but she still sought to record people and places, landscapes, which in her words took on the timelessness of art. Continuing with the theme of women's dress and how women are portrayed, is this photograph by Aubrey Bodine. Bodine was a features photographer for the Baltimore Sun and extensively documented Chesapeake life in the mid-century. So these women here are sunbathing. It's the 1950s. There's no restriction on their clothing, and they're swimming. There's a young woman coming out of the water. Her hair is wet. She's clearly not restricted at all, which would have happened historically. Then we have another Constance Stuart Larrabee image, a kind of an idealized portrayal of young women at play on the Chester River on a converted workboat yacht. Larrabee's intention was always to let subjects speak for themselves. She really tried not to insert her own viewpoint. And her love of the Bay and being on the Bay herself is very evident in his photo. Because she didn't insert her own viewpoint, we can kind of use the photos to speak for themselves. They invite them to be unpacked, to understand more, or to use them to illustrate something about history that we want to tell. So you can really see more of the vitality in Larrabee's work, and particularly in these series of photos from Tangier Island. These are favorites of ours, and we treasure them at the museum. She did a tour to Tangier Island in 1955, really just a weekend, and she took an incredible series of photographs. Here we just have a woman hanging clothes on the clothesline, a routine task against a backdrop of simple houses. In the first photograph, you can even see beyond the fence line, a workboat in the background. It shows the ever-present connection to maritime life, the rough marshy terrain, simple clapboard houses, the way that people lived. Her style of dress is old-fashioned, even for the 1950s, and it clearly shows evidence of a place where modern life had not even fully encroached. And she's doing everyday work, but yet Larrabee's lens makes it seem dignified. And so the role that women had in the family economy often involved household chores. And I always ask myself, as a historian of women's history, does that make that any less valuable or important to our story? And I'd say no. The portrait on the left is of Annie Daly. It's one of Larrabee's more well-known photographs. It's similar to the one she took of African women and reminds me a lot of New Deal photography. Many years later, our chief curator learned the identity of this woman. Her name, as I said, was Annie Daly. She was known as the oldest woman on the island. And when Larrabee took these kinds of portraits, she liked to engage her subjects in conversation. And she was also using a Brownie camera, which you look down on. So you held it at your chest level and you look down on it. This is where the internet is failing me. And that's one of the ways she was able to look up, have a conversation, and then take these portraits that I think also in looking up kind of ennobled the people that she was shooting. And then they're also just very honest and natural. And then the photograph on the right is a group of women walking from church, Swain Memorial United Methodist Church there on Tangier Island. Methodism, as most of us know who live here, is historically incredibly entrenched on Delmarva, past and present, and the church was central to the community and religious life. It's also a place where women held and could exert more power and moral authority, because mothers, as many of us know, were the ones that encouraged the family to regularly attend church. Sometimes we have a portrait of a woman and we don't know much about her. And so as I prepared this talk, the first time that I gave it, about a year ago, I dug into this Aubrey Bodine photograph of a woman named Hilda Crockett. She's identified simply as the owner of the Chesapeake House on Tangier Island, a business which actually is still operating. So I did a little digging. In 1939, Hilda Shores Crockett began a business. She provided home-cooked meals and lodging to visitors on Tangier. She had a reputation for fabulous hospitality, comfortable rooms, famous crab cakes. Later, she purchased a second house and expanded her business across the street and served visitors coming over on the ferries from Virginia and Crisfield. And later, her daughters took over the business. The thing I learned about her is that although she had children, she appears never to have married the father of those children. She needed to support her family, and so she ran a successful business independently in a place that was and probably still is very traditional. Her recipes were published in a cookbook, and she clearly took pride in her work, which is one of the things I read in the subtext of this photograph. And she passed on an amazing legacy to her children and her family members. Another Bodine photo is of Edna Hopkins, who for many years went to sea with her husband, Captain George Hopkins, aboard the Doris Hamlin from 1911 to 1939. She was aboard for most of those trips. It shows a different type of sea captain's wife, very different certainly from my great-grandmother. And it's a cozy scene. She's embroidering a very comfortable looking paneled cabin, creating, I guess, essentially a home away from home, and certainly fulfilling a very traditional gender role in all of the ways that we might expect. And these photographs are very new to our collection. The series of images showing Dorchester County and Estella Mills Willie skinning a muskrat, and they're on the right-hand side stretching the pelt over a board in the 1960s. Estella's son, Guy, was an avid outdoorsman who ended up working in wildlife conservation. He worked for Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge for 33 years. I knew him well. And her grandson, Robbie, is actually featured in our new Dave Harp photograph exhibition in his skinning shed. So many generations practicing this traditional way of harvesting the marshes down in Dorchester County. So the work of skinning and stretching the hides for hanging and curing was essential to the business. The business was selling the pelts, and it was an important source of seasonal income for many people during the long winter season. when other harvests were not possible. Stella's family notes that the way she was paid for her work was that she was allowed to sell the muskrat meat, which did indeed have a market, not so much anymore, but certainly did historically. And she did this work for her entire life. But as one of her grandsons remembers, I know for a fact she never entered the marsh. So she was key to this local industry, but yet she never went into the place where the muskrats were harvested. We know similarly that women, Black and white women, picked and dressed geese for local hunters and for gunning clubs. But I don't know of a single photograph in our collection that represents that work, and many other ways that women supported themselves and contributed to their family income. So I was very excited to get this series of photographs from a childhood friend of mine, and to add them to our collection to show that kind of ordinary but important work. The photographs, I just want to add, were taken by Stella's son, other son, Ray, who also trapped for most of his life. I included the close-up portrait in the center because it really, to me, I see that as a son's love for his mother. He had not only the presence of mind to document the work that she did for them, his brothers and all, but it showed that he appreciated that, the value of her contribution to that part of the family income. So here in this last series of photographs I talked about, we have examples of what we might call the ordinary in women's lives: recreation, household work, supporting the family in perhaps traditional ways at home, not really, minimizing the fact that the work was done at home, but they were in many ways, isolated from men. But the heart of what we do at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum is to talk about the interactions between our community and the Bay. So community life is important, but is there a strict gender line between women's place in the community and the work of the fishing industry? So this image by Aubrey Bodine showing Eastern European women shucking oysters in the packing house, it's the William H. McGee packing house in Baltimore, shows that they were involved in that industry. And here we also see Bodine's wonderful use of light to make this photo particularly dramatic, that the woman looking over her shoulder is quite ghostly. I'm not sure what, would love to know more about her. And then we have this Robert de Gast photo in 1970, which shows men and women working side by side, shucking oysters. This is the McNasby Oyster Company in Annapolis. And this also documents African-Americans' key role in the oystering industry. They have gloves, aprons, and wooden shucking stalls protecting them in a miserable, cold, damp environment where they had to shuck these oysters all day. The fastest shuckers earn the highest wage, no matter what their gender. So that's important to note. But the question that it begs is, were immigrant and Black women the only ones who worked side by side with men? In recent years, we will see that women dominate in the crab picking houses. We have a triptych, this triptych of images in our current David Harp exhibition at the museum, and shows the transition in the cultural identity of the women who are working in the packing houses from, the white women and Black women of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then the transition in that period to Latinas from Mexico who come and pick seasonally on work visas. So now we want to explore whether packing houses were the only way that women were involved in the seafood industry. There was, an attitude for many years, it may still exist, that it's unlucky to have a woman aboard a boat. So where we typically find women serving in the fisheries is in these supporting industries or supporting roles. Again, is that an inappropriate or misleading term? I don't know that it's fair to call it supporting. Preparing nets, baiting, marketing the catch, these are all essential to the work of the waterman or waterwoman. So it's frustrating that sometimes we characterize it as supporting. There's a side note, in the study of women's history, early women's history studies elevated women's work. And that it was important. There's a book, one of my favorite books is called Never Done, and talks about women's unpaid contributions to the family economy that were nonetheless essential to survival, and often were the only thing that brought in cash income, things like butter making and sewing and cooking. But we also want to find out, how and where were these women contributing outside the home? We know that happened. We need to look for the evidence because surely they were there. And we find that the evidence is there, but we really have to dig for it. We just have a few images. Again, our chief curator once said that the absence of evidence for women in the fisheries doesn't mean, is not proof that it did not exist. Things have changed significantly in the mid-20th century for women on the Chesapeake, after women perhaps were called to help with the war effort, and then first began working the water with their husbands and brothers. This is Margarita Creighton culling oysters for her husband in the 1950s. Finally, evidence that women were out on workboats participating in the fishery as full participants, suffering and doing the heavy work along with their husbands. This is the earliest example I was able to find. Here we have another Robert de Gast photograph, similarly showing the woman culling. By that time, that kind of work may have been more commonplace. We don't know the identity of this particular woman. But by the 70s, second wave feminism was prominent in our country. The first studies of women's history were already making it into textbooks and out of academia, at least into the mainstream knowledge. So here and there we have representations of this change to women's work, but the best representation we have comes from intentional work. And we have in our collection at the Maritime Museum, we're very happy to have the collection of Lila Line. She was a freelance writer who in the 1970s fell in love with the Eastern Shore and moved to Talbot County in 1980. And 2 years later, she published the groundbreaking book called Water Women. We have many of her photographs as well as her research in oral history and oral histories. She wasn't a trained folklorist. She was more of a journalist, not a cultural historian, but her work shows how combining documentary photographs with interviews can really help to fill in the narrative for these missing or hidden stories. Here in these photographs, we have a woman named Laura Era, who grew up in Dorchester County, and she's culling oysters that she and her husband just tonged. She's very young, she's lovely, traditionally feminine, a very compelling subject. I always have to wonder in that photo on the right if she had her nails done before this photo shoot. Certainly doesn't seem like a very practical manicure for that kind of work. Line also captured wonderful quotes from each of her subjects, things like, from Laura Era, nobody tells you what to do and when to do it when you're working out on the water. She actually brought her 3 children with her when she would go out on the boat, would take breaks to feed and play with them. And she is still in the community, had a degree in archaeology, and she's currently a local artist. In 2016, Lydia Woolover re-interviewed Laura Era, who ended up spending 28 years culling oysters with her husband. But she said in 2016, I won't make it sound like it was all romantic. It's damn hard work. Your shoulders are aching, your hands are freezing. You get a mud facial every day. It's a hard life, but it's so basic, and there's no prettier place on a beautiful day. I'll try not to get too excited about all the quotes. They could go on. They're wonderful. Really give voice to these images. Next, we have Kathleen Poole, and another person that Lila Line profiled. Kathleen Poole is 9 months pregnant in these photos. Her son was born about 3 weeks after the interview. She had come from DC down to the East Coast. She was working on tall ships and discovered the bay, fell in love with it with her boyfriend, and began crabbing off of Tillman Island. She started by culling oysters, working in a packing house, and then she learned from local crabbers how to trot line. It was a pet project of her. The local watermen were the ones who showed her what to do. She did not grow up knowing how to do this, how and when, where to crab. And then one summer she bought a bigger boat and headed out on her own. She worked on a skipjack, and she really found that the best thing that working on the water for her at that point in time was the independence, and you never have to worry about being laid off. Patsy Higgs, maybe a more traditional story, the daughter of a Rock Hall waterman, began working on the water as a teenager. My favorite quote from her is, I worked with him, meaning her father and her brother, or her husband rather, just like a man. I worked with him just like a man, which is something I heard a lot in my family when a woman was able and willing to do hard work, which many of them were. She worked stringing nets, removing fish from the nets. She's a full partner in that business, was a full partner in that business, understood the risks, had the same knowledge of the water and the weather that was required. And so line found that the women who chose this type of work, they knew the risks, but they chose it because it gave them the independence that they craved. And then I couldn't leave out our own diver, Susan Briggs, that Lila Line talked to. When she was interviewed in 1981, she had just started diving for oysters in the Wye River. She wasn't born and raised on the Eastern Shore. She was actually a nurse by training, but loved scuba diving. And she really struggled to find a waterman who would show her how to dive. It was kind of risky work. Some men raised their eyebrows and ignored her, she remembered, and then others encouraged her and finally helped her find success. So thinking about those last two women, I have to wonder if for Poole and Briggs, if it was easier because they weren't they were outsiders. They weren't born and raised on the Eastern Shore. Maybe they weren't pigeonholed as much, which is something that Susan Briggs noticed. In 1982, Lila Line noted that the women who worked harvesting the bay's fisheries were generally unrecognized. They had 9% of crabbing licenses, 250 or 4% of oyster licenses, and only 0.5% of commercial fishing licenses. And more recent statistics that I found were that over 8% of all fishing licenses were held by women, but you still don't hear too much about them. So as I said, Lila Line's work demonstrated that the women's stories and experiences were just as valid as those of men. You'll see a similar series here. We, following Lila Line's lead at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, contracted with a folklorist named Kelly Felteau in the 1990s to do just that, to as a trained cultural historian, to document the industries and the people of the region with photographs and oral histories. And here we have, very similar to the Dave Harp series, women, African-American and Latina workers in the crab picking houses, J.M. Clayton Company, and also A.E. Phillips Seafood. This kind of intentional work by cultural historians and anthropologists and oral historians can be tremendously valuable. It's a standard practice when you do an oral history interview to at least take one portrait of a subject, and if you're on site with them, to talk and to show their work. So it's an incredibly rich kind of work that can take place. Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum has a similarly rich series of photographs, but without the stories behind it. This series represents the work of those women who worked on the first Maryland Dove project at Jim Richardson's yard near Cambridge in the 1970s. These are all photos by Robert de Gast, so excellent, beautiful quality. And we have dozens and dozens of them. And we're currently building the new Maryland Dove at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, as some of you may know. So we're going to take this opportunity, and we've been in the planning for quite a long time, to interview as many of the shipwrights as possible who worked on that original project in the 1970s in order to fill out the story behind these photographs. These were the photographs that really got me excited and inspired for our upcoming exhibit, which we're calling Dovetails. We're going to build upon the story of the quote unquote hippies that worked on the project, which included a couple women. And so we've scanned all of the Gast images and are in search of more images documenting that legendary project by Jim Richardson. These images here you see are Kathy Moore pounding a fastener on a frame, and Jim Richardson explaining and showing the lines of Dove to Kathy. What kind of opportunity was that for a young woman to learn from a renowned master boat builder? Today, we actually have two women working on Maryland Dove, or working in the CBMM shipyard, and one works with our Rising Tide program, teaching middle schoolers woodworking and boat building skills. Another one of my favorite images from the de Gast series is this one of June Wingo. Here she's painting or varnishing the deck. On the right, she's wielding an axe very aggressively. Wingo had been a waitress before she joined the apprentices building Dove at Jim Richardson's yard, and certainly shows that they were full participants. So these are the kinds of questions we're going to ask, and I will be asking hopefully in the next several months. How did they come to work on this project? What inspired them to do that? Was it an extension of their upbringing, a departure from how they were raised? How did they interact with the other shipwrights? How did they interact with Mr. Jim? You know, we can't expect that it was necessarily a universally positive experience. My initial interactions with them indicate that it was a life-changing and positive experience for them. So that's good, but there's got to be more to the story. And this will give a very nuanced and personal aspect to this story that we will interpret in an exhibition, and really connect it nicely with what's going on at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum right now. So I will conclude here with my favorite image. I actually have it up on my office wall, which is again June Wingo caulking the Dove. Just the image and the picture of strength and skill, and surely a story or an image with a rich story behind it. Men's roles in the fisheries are unquestioned. So if we look for evidence of contributions at the margins, and this is not just women, this is the African Americans, this is the Latinx community, you know, are we marginalizing their contributions by not looking to uncover those stories? For a long time, nobody had any interest in telling these kinds of stories. Early women's history finally moved beyond the stories of great women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the suffragettes, things like that, to explore the lives of early women and everyday life. They validated it. They called it hidden history. So how can we now take that complex narrative of life on the Chesapeake and make it a whole instead of, you know, just telling these individual stories? How can we make it part of the larger whole? And more recent models of women's history use you know, a very realistic mode of narration. So, you know, maybe attempting to be something like Lisa C's, you know, narrative, where it's story-based without having dialogue and things like that. You know, trying not to leave out anybody's story to make sure everyone is included. And we do this, you know, as good historians, as good museum curators, by diversifying our sources, by evaluating them critically, comparing them to each other, questioning the official versus the unofficial and published sources, and what has been left out. The tension that we feel and the challenge that we have is wanting to move beyond gender distinction, to wanting to not say, well, she did this because she was a woman, or despite the fact that she was a woman. But it is testimony to say that we've come so far in a single century that we can have conversations about some measure of equality for women and other groups, and to make them part of the story that we tell. The experience of typical women and outliers, and whether the women who went out and worked on the water themselves were outliers, nonetheless, the stories of all these women are valid, are important. What it teaches us is that there's really no common experience for women. Our lives, my life, is varied and messy, and what makes my work so fascinating is just uncovering the richness of that story. It makes telling that so much more compelling. So that's all I have in the formal one. I have not been checking the chat box, but
no problem. We had one question that came in specifically about the photos of the woman who was skinning muskrats. The question being, what were they used for commercially?
They were used for wraps, for furs, for coats. Notoriously at the National Outdoor Show, I think in the 1950s, I believe that the winner wore a muskrat bikini. I'm 90% sure that story is true. So they were used, and they still are. Not as obviously the market has fallen off tremendously. I think there still is a market for it. I think it's abroad and not as much in this country.
And there's a comment of thanks. That was fascinating. And if there are other questions, you can either use the question and answer feature, or if you would like to raise your hand, I can turn turn on your ability to talk if you'd like to just speak a question. You can certainly do that too. And I actually have a question while we're waiting to see if anyone else does. You talked about the balance of how some of your photos, you know the backstory, and some of them, it is just the image itself. Are there any that you have made a discovery or put a piece of the story together that have been particularly exciting for you?
Well, I think that many of them are the ones that I've included tonight. I did a lot of work to construct those stories. But what I will say is that that work never ends. You know, as I mentioned, the Muskratting series was, you know, donated by a friend of mine and a family I've known all my life. But until I quizzed them like they were donors, like I would a typical donor, about the provenance and the history, I didn't ask, you know, I didn't know any of these details. I didn't understand the full nuance of that. And it's actually part of my own family story. You know, I have an aunt who recently died at 94, and she recalls, you know, being forced, not by desire, to go out as a young teenage girl to help her father check his traps in the marsh. Not pleasant work, but when you're, you know, living during the Great Depression, when the family income is limited, that was what was required, and it was required of both boys and girls. She was the oldest, but she did have a brother, and he helped as well. So women were often called upon to do things in challenging times. I do see this question. I see the question about doing an exhibition of women's role in the Chesapeake. And well, so what I will say is this talk originally came out of an exhibition of the photographs of Morris and Stanley Rosenfeld. They're renowned as yacht photographers, but they also did a lot of commercial photography in the New England and New York area. That's their collection is held by Mystic Seaport Museum in Mystic, Connecticut. And we featured that, just came down about a month ago. And I said, we can't have this exhibition of these wonderful Rosenfeld photographs without showing that we have images of women at work and at play in our own collection. So there was a designated section of 9 photographs of women on the Chesapeake as part of that. I also hope that group of 9 photographs may travel around to arts councils, historical societies, et cetera, in the future, just to get the word out. My only reservation about doing an exhibition just about women is not that it's not needed, but that I really just want to make sure we're including that story of women in every exhibition. And we have the same struggle and the same challenge with representing the story of our Black community. You know, we don't want to isolate it and make it, we want to make it part of what we do every day. And so I challenge myself to do the same thing with women, but I certainly think there are topics that we could focus on that center on women in the future. And certainly Dovetails, a prominent part of the Dovetails exhibition about the Maryland Dove will be these women, because I've identified and located both of them, and I will be interviewing them. So
that's fantastic, and it's really neat to hear that you are making inclusiveness the norm rather than just spotlighting. That's really great.
Yes, that is, you know, that's where that is the challenge that we're going through. You know, diversity is important, but we want to avoid tokenism.
Definitely. We have questions coming in both the Q&A and the chat. Susan mentions that if anyone's interested in tasting muskrat, there's a restaurant in Ellendale, Delaware, where you can find it on the menu. A question about whether there are any current opportunities to apprentice or volunteer in these interesting and intriguing activities.
Absolutely. Well, our apprentice program is actually a state certified program. And so it's actually, so we have a formal apprentice program. There are a myriad of volunteer opportunities, and we are easing back into that. You know, obviously we're still under some kind of COVID restrictions. But on our website, there is a section for volunteers to express interest in volunteering. I think there is a questionnaire where you can talk about what particular areas of interest you might have. And we have a a huge core of volunteers that offer us and countless hours that we couldn't do what we do without them. So, you know, they're very important to the work, to our work.
That's great. A question about the woman who had been a waitress before her shipwright work. Do you know what profession she followed after she?
I'm not sure, but I will be interviewing her. I actually spoke with her, and finally I said found her. I don't think she was hiding. She's currently living in Maine, and I know when I talked to her, she was extremely busy putting in her garden. She is still building, very much working with her hands. So, and was, you know, a fascinating person just to speak with for a few minutes. So I'm really looking forward to talking to her. I think it's safe to say that working on this project changed the course of her life and gave her skills that she continues to use to this day. Yeah. And the photos on exhibit now, gosh, as I said, several of these were, as we contemplate new exhibitions, I'm not sure, I'm sure that some of the ones of in our oystering exhibition, some of the ones of the workers in the packing houses that would include women, that would be one of these or very similar to these would be included. And as we think about future exhibitions, I've already identified several, of course, the Dovetails exhibition, but other exhibitions about harvesting the shorelines. I can see the muskratting images being used there, so.
There's a comment, a bit of surprise that you didn't mention the female skipjack captain. Is that a person who is part of the Maritime Museum collections or not?
The female skipjack captain?
That is what the comment says. I am not sure which captain it references.
Don't personally have the knowledge. Well, I did mention the one woman from Lila Line worked as a skipjack captain, but I'm guessing that this person means someone else. So what I would encourage you to do is to share that with me or contact me later. I'm sure Annie, well, my contact information is on our website, but also you could feel free to share it with anyone as well. At the museum, and I would love to know, or you can also, actually on my final slide, and you were going to share it, I didn't put that on there, you could search our collections. We have an online collections portal, collections.cbmm.org, where you can search the 50,000 photographs in our collection, most of which are not yet digitized, but they're described, but that is not ringing a bell for me. So I would love to know more about it to see if we do.
Jen says that she interviewed her in the late 80s in Cambridge, so she may be able to give you more connection there.
Great.
And I've put a link to the collections portal in the chat if anyone wants to take a look and see what the online collection looks like. And Cynthia has a question about donating to these programs. Cynthia, do you mean artifacts or photos? If you can clarify, I bet Jen can answer that question too.
I don't know if she means your particular program, which I think is certainly a very, very worthy, but there are multiple ways to support the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. Certainly, most of our collection is a community-built collection. It's primarily through donations and not through purchases, which is really a remarkable achievement. But you know, again, volunteering, and then of course on our website, you know, there are multiple ways you can support through monetary donations and simply by attending some of our programs. We do a series of talks as well. We're doing one's based upon the Dave Harp exhibition that we currently have, as well as one on climate change this fall. So there are lots of ways to get involved and learn more about what we're doing here. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question, but
Cynthia, correct me if I'm wrong. My interpretation of what you've put in there is that Are you asking how we can get more women to be involved in the programs? Or to support apprenticeship for women? Is that the question? Yes, that was what she was asking.
Sure. Well, and I'm not. We may actually have apprenticeship positions open right now. I'm not entirely sure. There's been it's a 2-year program. Again, I said it's state certified. We're always accepting applications, and actually one of the goals of our initiative for diversity, equity, and inclusion would be to looking to make our applicants and our pool more diverse. So like I said, there's already one woman specifically in the apprentice program, but it would be wonderful if we had more women apply to be shipyard apprentices, as well as to work at the museum.
Are there any other questions? Any burning desires that we haven't touched on yet? I just want to say thank you, Jen, very much. One of the things I love about doing programming is that it gives people a window into things that are incredibly interesting that they may not have thought to go look for. And this program, just from a couple people who, when they were signing up, I talked to them, I think this program has really provided that, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time and your expertise.
You're welcome. Enjoyed it.
And Jeffrey has put a note in saying that Katarina Enerfeldt won the Deal Island Skipjack race in 2014 with an all-woman crew.
That's fabulous. That's one of my volunteers. I'll talk to him tomorrow about that. We can never keep tabs on everything that's going on, which is why it's both, I don't know that it's frustrating. I never pretend to be the all-knowing curator, but it's one of the things that's so exciting is because we're always learning more about our history. We're always filling in gaps. It's I call it job security, but it's always something that we'll be working to make more complete, but it never will be complete. So that's exciting.
Well, on that note of things never being complete, I think we will complete the program. If anyone has additional questions or thoughts that they think of in 10 minutes, feel free to get in touch. One of the librarian's jobs is to connect people with information and resources, and Jennifer Dolde is a resource that I am pleased to be able to put people in touch with. Thank you all for coming. Like I said, we will be sending out a follow-up email that has a brief survey. I'm also putting the link in the chat. If you can just take a couple minutes to complete that, it would be incredibly helpful for the continuation of One Maryland, One Book.